Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, how bad have things grown for the media in Egypt? Even this puppet is accused of dealing in Muslim Brotherhood propaganda. Once again, it's daggers drawn in Turkey between Prime Minister Erdogan and the journalists trying to get to the bottom of a political scandal. Citizen-generated news imagery and the career-ending implications for professional photojournalists. And one last look at 2013 through the news lens. That's our web video of the week. When Egypt's military-backed government designated the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization last month, it broadened its authority to move against the group and to intensify its campaign of arrests. The decree also has serious implications for journalists because now covering the Muslim Brotherhood has become a minefield for the media. This channel has come under increased pressure with 3 Al Jazeera English journalists in detention, accused of communicating with members of a terrorist organization and spreading lies harmful to the state. They joined 2 of their colleagues from Al Jazeera's Arabic language news channels who are also behind bars. Al Jazeera's network of channels has been accused of failing to report the story in a balanced way. And Al Jazeera is not the only news outlet that's feeling the heat. Not even state-owned television is immune. The head of Nile TV was fired this past week for airing a documentary on deposed President Mohamed Morsi. Many in Egypt argue that in times of political crisis, media freedom must be curtailed for the sake of national security. But news organizations, many of their journalists, bloggers, and puppets, even puppets, have been affected. Our starting point this week is Cairo.
The atmosphere for journalists at the moment here is rather like in America after 9/11.
نشوف أن هذه نهاية الجماعة.
There's hardly any room for dissent or opposition voices on Egyptian TV, whether state or private TV channels.
The Egyptian government seems to believe that it's an opportunity to shut down media that produce oppositional content.
People are just doing their job, and then they get these very serious charges, and it's going to get worse.
The political crisis in Egypt is so serious, its effect on the journalism coming out of the country so profound, that to even mention the story of a mobile phone ad and a puppet named Abla Fahita would appear trivial. But it's not.
The story of Abla Fahita reflects Egypt's descent from the draconian into the farcical. This is literally the story of a terrorism probe focused on a puppet.
Abla Fahita, or Aunt Fahita, is an Egyptian Muppet-like cartoon character. This particular episode was a Vodafone advert in which Aunt Fahita is on the phone gassing away as usual to one of her friends, and this blogger, somebody called Spider, came up with a completely way out kind of psychedelic interpretation of this video clip, that in fact this was some kind of coded message for a terrorism conspiracy involving the Muslim Brotherhood. Vodafone officials were summoned by terrorism state prosecutors to explain themselves.
And it even got to the point where Abla Fahita was invited on the airwaves of a private TV channel to defend and deny the allegations, and was confronted by Ahmed Spider on TV. So, in one sense it's comedic, but in another sense it's very dangerous that they're willing to go to any extent to investigate any notion of terrorism.
The biggest media weapon, one that successive governments of all stripes have counted on, has been the state-owned broadcasting behemoth Egyptians call Maspero, and its more than 30,000 employees. On January 3rd, one of its main channels, Nile TV, made the mistake of broadcasting a pro-Morsi video, and the executive responsible paid for that with his job.
The video had been produced by a pro-Brotherhood organization and circulated online. It appears that someone who is sympathetic of Mohamed Morsi was able to slip it in and let it go to air. It was on air for about 8 minutes before it was noticed and removed. Callers contacted the station saying, how could such a thing air? That led to the shutting down of the broadcast and eventually the firing of the head of Nile TV.
This is what the interim government would prefer to see on Egyptian airwaves. Children dressed in military gear singing the praises of General Sisi.
I love you, Sisi.
And this video wasn't on state-owned media. It aired on privately owned channels that, in the days of Tahrir Square, were trumpeting their editorial independence. The Egyptian media is now broadcasting and going to print against a new legal backdrop. The declaration issued last month that the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the elected government just 7 months ago, is now to be treated as a terrorist organization.
This is a form of intimidation, really. What it is, it's really kind of intellectual and media intimidation, because it means that if there's any kind of remote sympathy to present a balanced story that does include the Muslim Brotherhood narrative in the account, then you're also going to run the risk of being labeled and stigmatized as being a terrorist yourself. To me, this is a form of curbing media freedom and press freedom in Egypt.
The Egyptian media have actually embraced this categorization of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, and really, adopted the jargon, the terrorist brotherhood, the terrorist brotherhood members. The few networks that are prepared to challenge this are self-censoring, if you will, or are becoming increasingly silent.
Or they are finding their journalists behind bars. 5 Al Jazeera employees are in Egyptian jails. The 3 most recently arrested work for Al Jazeera English. Producers Mohammed Fahmy and Bahir Mohammed and correspondent Peter Greste have all been in custody since December 29th. Among the charges, communicating with members of a banned terrorist organization.
Now the message is really clearly nobody is off limits. If you're not going to really tell the government, the pro-government narrative, you are really running some very harsh consequences and very serious consequences. Whether you are an Egyptian journalist, whether you're working with mainstream media, everybody who crosses a certain line that has been, set by the government is going to be prone to some kind of harsh consequences.
This is important to understand the context of what this is taking place in. Following Morsi's ouster, Muslim 25, the channel of the Muslim Brotherhood, and all Islamist channels were shut down. The only voices on the airwaves parrot the military government's narrative of a war on terror. So it's become a very polarized media landscape, and Al Jazeera Arabic provides one of the few places where people can go to hear the other end of the polarized spectrum.
وفي حلقة اليوم نحاول فهم دور الإخوان المسلمين في المرحلة القادمة من خلال حوارنا.
So the bias is on both sides.
Many people in the Islamist camp often express very extreme or radical views, including anti-Semitic views. And sometimes these views are aired on Al Jazeera. Now, these are usually guests. Al Jazeera, their argument would be, what can you do with these people? You can't just ignore them, you can't pretend these views don't exist. They're very important to hear whether you like it or not. So these are value judgments. I mean, the important thing to remember is that there's no such thing as objective truth, and all channels have failings.
Journalism chronicles societal and political change. Among the changes in the Egyptian media since the Arab Spring, Al Jazeera, lauded for its reporting by the protesters in Tahrir Square, is now vilified by many of those same people. Most of the private TV channels that fought the pro-Mubarak narrative on state-run TV in the name of democracy and freedom of expression are now among the biggest backers of an unelected military government that's cracking down on dissent. And Ala Abdel Fattah, one of the bloggers feted for his journalism and his bravery in 2011, is now in jail for taking part in a political protest. Times and seasons change. Spring has turned to winter in Egypt, and the effect on the country's journalism is chilling. Our Global Village voices now on the deteriorating state of journalism in Egypt.
Journalists are working here at the same time that the old regime is trying to get its shop back in order, which means they are facing intimidation and physical violence and possible incarceration as well. And I think with each new charge or arrest, it's clear that this is an extension of the crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood because they're framed within similar, if not identical, terms.
There have been a series of crackdowns against activists and the media since Morsi was ousted on July 3rd. but it's intensified in the last few months. A lot of that has to do with Sisi, who enjoys a lot of popular support right now, and a lot of people are willing to sacrifice their rights for the security of a strongman, and that includes the rights of journalists and the rights of press freedom.
It's time now for Listening Post Newsbites. In Turkey, a political scandal, a purge of police chiefs, and a legal ruling have once again put some journalists there on a war footing against the Erdogan government. The scandal has already led to the arrests of 2 businessmen and the sons of 2 cabinet ministers, all of which came as the result of a police investigation. That was followed by the removal of more than 100 police chiefs from their posts. Then came a directive from the National Police Association banning journalists from entering police buildings. That ban has since been overturned by a court, at least temporarily, but not before Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan was accused once again of trying to muzzle the Turkish media. Erdogan has gone after one journalist in particular, Mahir Zeynalov of the Zaman newspaper. Erdogan's official complaint said Zeynalov's tweets contained heavy insults and swear words in a bid to provoke the nation to hatred and animosity. Zeynalov has said his tweets were no more than references to reports that were already in the media. And government ministers are being told to get their tweeting under control by their deputy prime minister. After one minister tweeted claims he later admitted he could not substantiate, Deputy PM Bülent Arınç bemoaned the fact that even ministers never put down their phones and tweet day and night. A journalist who was shot in the final hours of 2013 became the first Pakistani reporter killed in 2014 when he died in hospital on New Year's Day. Sean Daher was a senior reporter for a channel called Ab Tak. He was gunned down on his way home in the Larkana district of southern Pakistan. According to Ab Tak, one arrest has been made in connection with the murder, which is significant. Few of those who kill journalists in Pakistan ever get arrested, and convictions in those cases are almost unheard of. Fellow Pakistani journalists protested in Karachi following Daher's murder, calling on the government to do more to protect media workers. The Brussels-based International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ, ranks Pakistan 3rd on its list of the world's most dangerous countries for reporters. 10 were killed there last year. The IFJ's president, Jim Boumelha, said of this latest murder, the lack of accountability for acts of violence against journalists in Pakistan reinforces the culture of impunity. The authorities must take the action required to ensure that the perpetrators of such extreme acts of violence answer for their crimes. There are more signs from Myanmar that the country's huge media reform project might not be living up to its billing. Dozens of journalists marched in Yangon January 7th, calling for the government of the former military man Thein Sein to respect the right to free speech. The protest followed the arrest and conviction of Mah Kain, a reporter from the Daily 11 newspaper. She was sentenced to 3 months in prison after she interviewed a lawyer for a story about corruption. The lawyer subsequently sued her for defamation. Wei Fio, the chief editor of the Daily 11, said that the sentence was aimed at sending a message. The judge could have imposed a fine, but deliberately gave the prison sentence not only to threaten the reporter, but to threaten press freedom. Daily 11 is the largest and most widely circulated of a number of publications that have emerged since a decades-old ban on privately owned newspapers in Myanmar was lifted just 9 months ago. The authorities in Bahrain are continuing to hold a photojournalist in detention for his work documenting the country's ongoing protest movement. Ahmed Al-Fardan provided images for a number of agencies, including Nur Photo, Demotics, and SIPA. According to his father, he was taken from his home by security forces in the early hours of December 26th. The opposition Bahrain Mirror news agency reports that family members have visited Al-Fardan in prison and that his x-rays show fractures to his ribs. It's not the first time Al-Fardan has been arrested. When protesters from the Tamarod opposition movement took to the streets in August of last year, he was reportedly detained and beaten, with security forces demanding information on political activists. The Paris-based Press Freedom Organization, Reporters Without Borders, demanded Al-Fardan's unconditional release, calling on the Bahraini authorities to stop using arbitrary detention to gag dissident journalists. Such practices constitute a grave threat to freedom of information and flout Bahrain's international obligations. Newsrooms across the globe are shrinking, budgets are being slashed, jobs have grown scarce, and the hardest hit people in the industry, according to the Pew Research Center, are photojournalists. The Washington-based think tank conducted a study, and it concluded that in the U.S., the ranks of photographers and videographers have been almost cut in half over the past decade or so, from slightly more than 6,000 in the year 2000 to fewer than 3,500 in 2012. Doomsayers are predicting the end of a profession. They're calling photojournalists a dying breed, soon to be replaced with newer, cheaper, omnipresent citizen journalists equipped with smartphones and a broadband connection. Citizen-generated images are a better fit under current shoestring news budgets, but they can, in some cases, leave the news consumer looking at an inferior product. The Listening Post's Nic Muirhead now on the digitally driven crisis in photojournalism.
Photographs have helped to illustrate some of the most important stories over the ages, from the Hindenburg disaster in Germany, 1937, the US's World War II victory at Iwo Jima, 1945, the self-immolating Buddhist monk in South Vietnam, 1963, the famine in Somalia, 1993, 9/11, 2001. But imagine those stories without the images. This will help. On November 14th last year, the French daily Libération ran the paper for the first time in its history without any photographs.
The message was very simple. Look, this is what it is. If you have a newspaper, a daily without any photographs, this is what it looks like. And there's obviously something missing because photography is part of information, is news. The way you look at photography or your pictures is also the way you look at news. It's a different form of news. It's a different way of informing people.
I don't think it's said that the art of photojournalism is dying. I think what it illustrated more to me was about the power of photography in whatever guise it takes. Photography should really be seen as the entry point to a story. It provides a visual reference. It draws the reader into that story. And it can provide fantastic context to illustrate the story as a whole.
Sometimes if a certain piece of news happens and there wasn't a picture, it almost feels like it didn't happen. So I get the sense that photojournalism is actually becoming more crucial than ever before.
It's great that big publications value what we do, but if you really value what we do, pay us. Pay us what we're worth. To me, that would be more impressive than a bunch of empty boxes.
Analysts say that there have been more photographs taken in the last 2 years than have ever existed in human history. With that plethora of imagery, professional photography has been reduced in value, especially as big news organizations try to find ways to cut their costs. Theoretically, camera phones in a digital internet era means that anyone can be a photojournalist. But how does the theory work in practice? On May 30th last year, the Chicago Sun-Times fired its entire photography staff, opting instead to train its reporters to take photographs with their iPhones.
There's been some awful examples of the reporters doing stuff with the iPhones.
Rob Hart was one of the photographers who lost his job at the paper. Clearly, he has not been impressed with the reporter iPhone coverage so far. For instance, in November last year, a tornado whipped through the state of Illinois, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The imagery was powerful. So was the story of the town's high school football team defying a natural disaster to practice for the state semi-final that weekend.
You would think, man, there's going to be some great visuals of the team really coming together, and they still have a field, but a lot of these kids may not have homes to go to. And the photo was just a picture of the back of someone standing on the field, and it was shot by the reporter. It's an afterthought. Whereas, we would have been there. You would have seen what it's like for the star quarterback or the lineman that doesn't have a house to go to. Where is he living? That's the story we would have told, visually. And instead, you just get something that fills that box.
It's not the same if it's taken by a professional, if it's taken by you and me. It's the same thing actually with writing and text. Everybody through the internet can think he is a journalist, but he's not. Because there's a lot of rules in terms of journalism. It's the same thing with photography. I can take a picture. It's not a good photograph. A professional is going to take a picture. It's going to tell me something.
But even when photojournalists are able to produce the image, it doesn't always mean that they're going to get paid. Freelancer Daniel Morel's photographs of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti showed us in front pages across the globe the horrors of that disaster. The images were distributed by photo agencies Agence France Presse and Getty Images, only they were not submitted by Morel, but rather illegally obtained off Twitter, according to a New York jury, which found that the agencies had willfully infringed on Morel's copyright. he was awarded $1.2 million in a landmark ruling that photojournalists hope will curtail the growing number of copyright abuses over the internet.
The problem is there's so much, so much photography now on the internet everywhere. You have to be careful about who it belongs to, who's done that, and you have to be careful of the whole circuit of distribution. Obviously, once it's in the files of a photo agency, it goes all over the world, and then it's like it's a domino effect. Everybody using it without knowing.
I think this case was extremely significant, because in a way it pushed for what almost every photographer has been suffering from, which is the copyright infringement. And I'm sure there's been a huge revision among all these agencies regarding precautions taken next time. And it's definitely a bit of a bright news in an otherwise struggling industry.
The key for photojournalists is to find a way to harness the power of the internet instead of losing material and in some cases their jobs to it. If they manage to do that, then this is not the end of photojournalism, just the beginning of a new, lucrative era.
I don't think photojournalism could ever die. That'd be hard to kill. Photojournalism has to be evolving. If you look at the first photograph of a human being from 1838 in Paris, it was a 10-minute exposure. So it took 10 minutes just for this person to show up on the piece of film. And a guy can shoot a picture in Syria and send it around the world, and someone in California can see it and comment on it before that first photograph is even exposed. So, the world we live in is amazing.
But think back and imagine those historic news images captured by an amateur trying their best on a smartphone. That paints a picture of what news, as we've come to see it, would look like without photojournalists.
More Global Village Voices now on what's left of the photojournalism business.
The mistake we make is assuming that an amateur photographer with an iPhone can adequately replace a veteran news photographer who's armed with instincts and training that comes from years of working in tense and dangerous situations. Take a look at the photos that were taken at the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi last year. Veteran war photographers like Goran Tomasevic and Tyler Hicks went towards the danger and made some incredible images. You can't replace those people and that level of experience.
When departments are just relying on citizen journalism, they're kind of leaving things up to happenstance and chance. The stories that they tell are not as rich and not as complete when they're not accompanied by images that have been thoughtfully, professionally taken.
Finally, it may seem a little bit late for a retrospective of journalism in 2013, but the reason we've selected this next video is because it underscores some of the points that we've just made in that piece on photojournalism. The international news agency Reuters compiled the video of what it called the extraordinary images taken by its global network of photographers last year. It includes Osman Orsal's photograph of Turkey's Taksim Square protests and the heavy-handed measures taken by the riot police. There's Joe Penny's photograph of a group of Malian children playing on the rooftops of a football stadium during the fighting there. However, pay attention in particular to the last image in the video. It was taken by a Chinese photographer, Chen Shangqiu. It shows a group of tourists and a wall of water. Chen manages to capture the water and a wave of phone cameras, simultaneously recording the event. With more than 325,000 hits online, Reuters' Pictures of the Year 2013 is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.